What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the Mining Pod. We've got an awesome show lined up for you today. We've got Rob Warren, author of the Bitcoin Miners Almanac, here to tell us all about his book, which I highly recommend y'all purchase and read. It's a great intro to a lot of Bitcoin mining concepts that can be very abstruse for people, and he breaks it down very clearly, very succinctly. And he's a good writer to boot. You know, we love that here at BlockSpace.media. We're all writers and media heads ourselves. But before we welcome Rob to the stage, a quick word from our sponsors, and then we'll kick off the show.
Accelerated by Compass is the premier accelerator program for Bitcoin mining sites at any stage of development. Our managed services provide expert guidance in site procurement, construction, energy agreements, and mining operations. Compass helps clients meet timelines and expectations for operational excellence, from greenfield to retrofits and everything in between. Don't just mine, excel. Visit compassmining.io now to discover how Accelerated by Compass can power your success.
Are you a retail or institutional investor interested in Bitcoin mining companies? The Miner Mag brings you free data and analysis from all major NASDAQ-listed Bitcoin mining operations to know who stands out. Check out visualized metrics and data-dependent stories at theminermag.com.
All right, and we're back with Rob Warren, author of the Bitcoin Miners Almanac. Rob, how we doing on this beautiful Friday, man?
Oh, I'm feeling great. It's a pleasure to be here. You're everywhere, and I see you're somewhere scattered across the U.S. But I'm always pleased to see you in person. We got to connect in Nashville.
Yeah, it was good to see you, man. Trying to be somewhat ubiquitous. Always good to come home. That was a fun conference. It's kind of surreal seeing all these Bitcoiners like frequenting honky tonks in my hometown that no one ever went to, by the way, until somehow they became popular. But anyway, it was great to see you. I hope you had a good time. Safe travels home. Hope it was a productive conference for you.
It was a blast. It was very different characteristically that I'm wondering if people were able to kind of pick up on it. It felt different. It felt big. We were finally getting some very interesting headliners. I've never seen more Secret Service in my entire life. But the tone has shifted, right? The tone has shifted.
I think the Overton window for a lot of things has really shifted in Bitcoin's favor. I mean, I think that, Trump going to PubKey, that happened this week. He did this Bitcoin burger purchase, One of the things that Thomas Pacchia, the co-founder of PubKey, told me in an interview for the BlockSpace newsletter that we just put out today, I really appreciated, said he really wanted to make it somewhat apolitical. Obviously, it's hard to do. Bitcoin has become a very political topic. Yeah. But he said, we want everyone here. This is a big tent. We want Republicans, Democrats. He sent out invites to the Biden campaign, to the Harris campaign, Vivek, RFK, everyone. But it does say something that Trump was the only one to pick that up. I think that's interesting. But we didn't come here to talk politics. We came here to talk about your awesome book, The Bitcoin Miners Almanac. And for anyone who has not seen this book advertised before, Rob took a bunch of mining concepts, broke them down to a very granular level, and published this beautiful 200-page book. It's a really good introduction to a lot of the high-level concepts that Bitcoin miners need to be thinking about and looking at them from a bunch of different angles. So just to kick it off, Rob, what inspired you to write this book? What was kind of the genesis moment? Was there like a eureka aha moment that this is what I need to do? Did you wake up one morning and the Bitcoin mining muse sung to you from up high, like 1,000 miners whining in a mega mine in the middle of South Texas? How did this come about?
Oh my goodness, that's poetic, and I have experienced the whine of 1,000 mines in a mega mine in South Texas, and both the cold aisle and the hot aisle, which is quite the experience. The impetus of it was naturally being somebody who likes to put synthesis to things and to schematize things and to make sense of things, and spending a long time feeling like an idiot. And I got into Bitcoin in 2016, 2017, and everybody puts in their 1,000 hours, 5,000 hours, 10,000 hours, and they start to understand the mechanics of this thing that is Bitcoin. And it's hard. It's hard conceptually. And you have to really grind to kind of figure out how the bits and pieces work, and way leads on to way. And thank goodness there have been so many just brilliant writers and authors in the space, whether you're on, a Reddit forum, our Bitcoin, when there was nobody there, or there's degenerate traders in 2017 who are the only people who are kind of talking about the mechanics of this stuff, or you're on the Cypherpunk mailing list, or you're on the Bitcoin forums. you have to kind of follow this path to put the pieces together in your head. And thank goodness there have been really good books that have come out to explain to people Bitcoin. But there was this kind of universal thing that happened when everybody got to Bitcoin mining, where the first thing they would say is, don't do it. It's not profitable. And you're like, dude, it's 2017, it's 2018. What do you mean it's not profitable? Like, how's the network going to run? Like,
I just existential threat to the network.
Like I just spent 1,000 hours figuring out what the hell this Bitcoin thing is, and you're telling me all these miners are not profitable. And you hear that, and then after a little while, way leads into way, and my personal journey was very much getting more. I understood Bitcoin as kind of an asset. I was thinking of it in like this asymmetric asset in 2017 to 2020. But in 2020, it really clicked in me that it is a living, breathing network. It is a living thing. And that is where the light bulb went off, and I said, well, what the heck is this mining thing? And so I started to get involved. I was fortunate enough to have met Neil Ronan Miner and Joe Rogers, who bought a pallet of S9s and broke it down and shipped it out to a bunch of degenerates who wanted to learn how to mine. And I was living in an apartment in...
One of those. Yeah,
that's exactly it. I was living in Denver at the time, and we had a little apartment in Wash Park, like a 5th-story apartment. And one day, 2 of these machines show up to my apartment, and I plug them into my bathroom. And my wife looks at me like, I don't think we're going to get married if you keep playing with your Bitcoins. And then it was off to the races, right? Then at about the same time, Steve Barber had just released plans on his Gen 1. This preceded his black box. This was a brown box. It was a version that had the internal geometry of the black box, but it was made from a single sheet of plywood. And so I ran out to the nearest Home Depot and drove them nuts because I asked them to make about 10 cuts in this sheet of plywood so I could schlep all this stuff back to my 5th-story apartment, and built a black box that then lived on our balcony throughout the entire winter.
I remember the social media post. I was super impressed. I was like, because I wanted to build one. I was like, I'm not going to take the time to do this. So I was like, damn, Rob's already got his setup. Like he's saving his future marriage already.
That's what it is. Necessity is the mother of invention, right?
Yeah.
So I had that, and at that point, I'm kind of hooked. You plug in this bizarre machine that kind of feels like this forbidden industrial equipment that you shouldn't have in your house. Like, I shouldn't be able to touch this. And you connect it to the internet, and you connect it to an electrical source, and you throw it outside and let it scream in your brown box. And all of a sudden you're hashing. And I started to kind of poke my head up and look around, and it occurred to me that there weren't good resources for people who were figuring out where we were going. The S9 was leading into the S19. That's why these S9s were getting so cheap, is because the S19s were coming out and they were just putting them to shame in the efficiency. The price was running up. We, the kind of lay consumer, could finally get our hands on them. And so all these business models were now starting to emerge. And we were hearing, 2019, 2020, 2021, as we're getting the run up, everyone is just hyped about their particular niche of mining. This was the very early days of mega mining sites that were getting set up, which feels crazy to say because it was like 4 years ago. Home mining was barely a thing. It's starting to become a thing. You're starting to get peripheral things. You're getting the black box. You're getting ways to mine at home, in the home, use the heat, don't use the heat. You were starting to get people that were doing immersion setups, early days immersion setups. And everyone was kind of talking their book. And it's a whole bunch of very technical, extremely smart people. But the thing that drove me nuts is that there was no synthesis to it. And me, I'm more like you, where we're like, we're linguistic people, right? We're kind of thematic. We're big picture. I thought, there's no resource that can really make coherence. Because if I can understand kind of the core principles of what's happening, then for me, I feel way more well equipped to say, oh, well, okay, here are the natural limits of this particular way of mining. In particular, there was a time when nobody would shut up about oil field mining. Everything was oil and gas mining. It's going to save the universe, the whales, the birds. It's going to save your ex-girlfriend. It's going to save your children from a fire. Nobody would shut up about vented and flared mining. And it's like, okay, but how does it actually work? Like, what are the natural constraints on vent and flare mining? Because you look at it and you go, oh, well, there's so much methane out there. But then you go, well, if I look at a single site, it's a single well, and there's tens of thousands of wells spread across a basin. And I have to put a single engine with a single container and somebody to monitor that single engine. And that container is going to power, I don't know, maximum 120 machines if I'm really lucky, probably closer to 25 machines. Okay, well, that doesn't make sense. That's not going to save the world. It might, over the next 20 years, it might be something that deploys and is beautiful and mitigates all this
Going to make
venture
some
flare
people a
natural
lot of
gas,
money.
make some people a
It's
ton
gonna
of
make
money.
some people a lot of money.
But it's characteristically extremely different from Riot Platforms buying Windstone and then turning it into a 700 megawatt, their own substation, huge 900 foot long buildings with 100 megawatt transformers and tens of thousands of machines lined up on the walls. It's characteristically different, and the business model is different. And so that was what I was trying to make sense of, and that was really the nucleus for the book, was how do I understand, just from a brass tacks, from a first principles perspective, where do we start so that we can make sense of all these different deployments, all these different businesses?
To me, it makes sense as a starting point, like the cornerstone being this idea that obviously not one mine is like the other. It seems obvious, obviously, to probably anyone listening to this podcast. But I think this is a real problem within the Bitcoin ecosystem. You know, people say Bitcoin community. It's really a bunch of sub communities. Understanding of all Bitcoin's working parts is extremely fragmented. I'm often shocked at how, on both sides, how little devs actually understand about the mining industry as it currently stands. A lot of them really do, I think, and a lot of hardcore Bitcoiners who are really immersed in the tech, who may not be devs, but kind of, earned their chops scouring Bitcoin talk, reading the white paper, learning about all of these technical proposals. They still kind of have this mental framework for mining as a dude in his basement who's building his own block templates and solo mining. That's
right.
And we're just now starting to get to a conversation like Matt Corallo talking about pools and centralization. I think he's a little bit, some of the talk kind of goes in a direction where I'm not totally comfortable because there's still some misunderstanding. But there's this, right. And there's this gulf of knowledge. Same thing with a lot of Bitcoin miners. I mean, a lot of the big industrial players, a lot of the big corporate players really don't know how Bitcoin works at a protocol level. And to an extent, I think that maybe that's okay. You want your CTOs and you want other people on staff to think about it.
That's right.
But one of the things that really struck me about your book is the first line, forget about Bitcoin, which again, I just think that's really good. Going back to, I'm not trying to blow a smoke up your ass or anything, but this is why I was saying I think that it's well written. There's hooks like that in it, and there are things that draw the reader in immediately. And at least for me, that opening line seems to suggest we are going to strip away what you think you know about how Bitcoin works to understand how Bitcoin mining actually works at scale and in these different levels. Can you kind of go into what your mental model was for starting with something like that? Because it's provocative, but I think it hits the right note.
I love that. I'm happy to hear that. It's really the case, right? We come with so many preconceived notions about this thing, but the nature of mining is that you actually don't start with Bitcoin. And there's a lot of really great Bitcoin miners that couldn't care less about Bitcoin, because to them, Bitcoin is just a tool. It's a means to an end. And to return to the prior example, the oil and gas example, a lot of oil and gas guys could care less about Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
What they care about is monetizing their minerals.
Yep.
That's all they care about. Bitcoin to them is the same thing as any other bolt-on apparatus that might increase their revenue or decrease their risk for their business model. The interesting thing that I think starting with forget about Bitcoin leads you into is that it pushes you to start from a new place. And so for me, that place was the physical Bitcoin miner. It was the machine. The machine is really interesting, right? Because we have seen these insane kind of log step improvements in the performance of the machine. You start with like CPU mining. And CPU mining, like this was all that Satoshi had envisioned. The white paper doesn't say anything about ASICs. Doesn't talk about FPGAs. Nothing. Doesn't say anything about chip
Doesn't talk
lengths.
about GPUs.
Doesn't talk about GPUs, nanometers, nothing. Doesn't talk about pools, because none of that stuff existed. It starts with, one CPU, one vote, because it was the case that you would run your computer and your computer would be your vote. It would be mining and it would be your full node. There's no conceptualization of this physical thing, this device, that all it does is hash. And that's interesting to me, because that's where you get this distinction between what the ocean guys are talking about, what Matt's talking about, how miners are doing hashing because they're not running their own nodes. It's a whole rat's nest to go into. And it's a very valid conversation. But the impetus of it is that it actually starts from a distinction that happened after the white paper, because Satoshi envisioned that miners were essentially the same things as nodes. There was no alternate conception of this physical apparatus. So when we get to the ASIC, we move kind of chronologically from the CPU to the GPU. And then when GPUs start mining is when you start to see, particularly Merrick comes out Slush, and on the Bitcoin Talk forums launches Slush Pool, which is essentially a way for people with less powerful machines to actually get rewarded for their contributions, their hashes to the network. And Merrick solves these really interesting problems by setting up the first pool, where essentially what you're doing is you have to create a system where a central agency, the pool is a central agency, has to assess that other people are working and assess if somebody actually has the correct proof of work. So you do that in a really interesting way, where if the proof of work, you have to have 20 leading zeros to fulfill the proof of work. This is what we say when we talk about like shares or shares accepted. The pool, the central pool says, oh, well, you just tell me every time that you hit 10 leading zeros. Because what that is from the pool perspective is, statistically, I'm going to hit that 10 zeros far more often than I am going to hit that 20. So it's a way of kind of indexing and saying like, oh, I can see that you're working, and so I can actually reward you on it. So he solved a really interesting technical problem in the setting up of pools. But as far as the machine itself is concerned, to kind of keep the chronology moving, CPUs, GPUs, FPGAs, which had this very brief kind of flash because at about the same time, the first ASICs were starting to emerge. You jump to ASIC mining, and then you see very quickly ASIC mining starts to take kind of a single recognizable shape. And these machines all kind of have the same rough schema, whether it's air-cooled or immersion-specific or hydro. And I think about this kind of in the terms of like early photography, right? In the early world of photography, you could have done like daguerreotypes or tintypes. You could have had these big 8x10 view cameras. There were all these different platforms and ways in which you would take photos. But the core principles was that a camera needed certain elements. And then with the explosion of what became digital photography, is all of a sudden you put a camera in everybody's pocket, or you have a digital SLR that everybody's using, and that kind of became a terminal platform or a terminal shape for what people use for cameras. You have a body, you have a lens, you have a recording medium. The body has to have a sensor. The sensor can have more megapixels or less megapixels. The lens can have certain numbers of elements. It's not determined, but the kind of rough shape is essentially uniform. Now, if you go to a professional photo studio, you could guess what the camera is going to look like. And the same thing was happening in the ASIC world, where all of a sudden these machines had kind of the same footprint. And so in my mind, I thought, well, okay, this seems like a reasonable starting place, because, and of course, somebody's going to blow it up by launching an ASIC that looks nothing like any prior ASIC, right? But it gave us a starting point where we said, okay, what are the parts of the machine? Okay, so every machine is going to need some kind of power supply unit. You got to convert that AC power into the DC power for your hash boards. You're going to have hash boards. You have to have some aggregate of chips that do the work. You're going to have some kind of control board, some kind of brain that talks to the machine and coordinates everything. And then you're going to have some kind of cooling, whether it's a fan or it's a hydro block or it's, an immersion setup, a plate or a tank or something like this. You can kind of distill everything that we're doing to these four elements. And if you can get it down to that, if you can say, these are the parts of the camera, or this is the parts of the bicycle or the parts of the car, then you can kind of naturally step into the next question, which is, well, how do I use it?
Where do I put it? Yeah.
Where do I put it? What do I do with it? And that was kind of the organic first principles approach that I took, which was, okay, we have a platform of a machine that hasn't reached a terminal state per se, but in terms of kind of schematizing it, there's not a lot you can do to really, aside from, getting rid of the PSU and running DC to DC, solar to your hash board, which can be done. Aside from putting some of the control board functionality directly onto the chip, which some of the Canaan machines do. There's no real radical departure. There's sort of exceptions to the rule as opposed to new rules. So that kind of was the launch point from going, okay, how do we run this thing? And then that took us out into the world of trying to understand the various elements that you need to actually successfully run these machines.
Yeah, and I feel like that structure makes sense to me. And then you get into, after this, you jump into different energy sources and how they relate to mining operations. Can you kind of talk us through, I guess to back up, can you talk us through like some of the challenges that you faced when you were kind of making that jump or going into the energy section? I mean, I imagine that was a lot of research, lot of time spent doing interviews. What were some of the unique challenges that you faced when you were structuring this book, and specifically with regards to the energy section? What's up?
It's all you know this, that you might spend 3 hours researching something just to make sure you don't say something dumb in a single paragraph.
Yeah. And then you still don't understand that thing. And then it's really frustrating.
And it's so complicated. It just, because the thing about, and I got asked this a couple of days ago, there was the Wyoming blockchain stampede. So I had the pleasure of being, I'm north of Denver in Colorado. So I had the pleasure of going up there and being able to participate in a panel. And it's so complicated. It's so hard to actually like convey these things in a way that makes any sort of reasonable sense to people, because you're trying to go like brass tacks. And we're sitting on this panel trying to kind of do brass tacks. But the second, you're sitting next to Curtis from Compass on one side and Pierre Richard on the other side, and you're like, how do you take somebody who's been in the space for like 10 plus years, and something he says so naturally is like a dissertation for somebody else to actually understand? It's so hard. And it's hard to make the arguments coherent. So when it came to the book and going into the world, right? Going into because we're a proof of work, right? That's something we hit on this panel, was like, proof of work necessitates that we are physically connected to the world, and we're connected through the electrical plug of the machine. Proof of stake, you can spin up a node anywhere. It's kind of it's a pay to play situation. It has accruing value based on the amount of the asset that you hold. It's a whole spiel there. There's a very good reasons why we like the proof of work, right? Like we like the SHA-256 squared. When you apply that to Bitcoin mining and the Bitcoin mining machine, right? There's three things you need to run a Bitcoin miner. You have to connect it to the internet, because my hashes have to connect to my pool or connect to my node. You have to have a source of electricity. You have to power the sucker, and you have to cool it because it's going to get hot. All the energy in means the energy has to go out. There's not energy that is preserved in the Bitcoin mining machine. That energy is not magically transmuted into the blockchain. We are not holding energy. A proof of work is a receipt. It's a receipt. It's not a battery. So when you successfully get the proof of work, and this is a bit of a side spiel, but I hear so many people calling Bitcoin mining a battery, and it drives me nuts. It is a receipt of proof of work. It's in the name. It is the proof of the work. It's not the work itself. What is preserved on the blockchain is the proof of your work, not the work that you did. You go into the world and you do the work. Use as much electricity as you want. You can power it with bicycles or gerbils or campfires or nuclear. It doesn't matter. All the network cares about is that you have the proof of the work, not that you have the work. The work is the watts going in and the heat coming out. It's all happening in the real world. The network doesn't care how hard you tried. The network only cares that you achieve the proof of work. You achieve the difficulty. So when you start to go down the rabbit hole of electricity, it kind of necessitates that you go two directions, right? You go on grid and you go off grid. And to be frank with you, off grid is substantially easier, because off grid is source of generation, stranded sources of energy. You've got huge oil basins, often the seas and the oceans, that are not financially viable to get them to market because the cost of gas is too low. You have stranded gas wells. That's pretty intuitive, right? It makes sense. You have huge reserves in Venezuela or the Arabian Peninsula. That makes sense. They have the oil. They have the natural energy. They convert the energy to the electricity. The grid is the most complicated shit on the face of the earth.
Right. So it's kind of sorry, I just have to interject here, because I feel like I really identify with this in terms of the research that I've done, and getting into, I'm sorry, I'm going to kind of anticipate what you're about to say, but learning the ins and outs of different power contracts,
dude,
and learning the ins and outs of how the power flows from the utility or the provider of the energy to the utility to the end consumer
is unbelievable.
is ridiculous. So was that maybe the biggest hurdle for you navigating all of those considerations when we're looking at the grid? And that's the other thing too, right? The grid is almost like the Bitcoin community or the Bitcoin network.
Yeah.
It's this vague, all-encompassing concept that is actually, in reality, just fragmented pieces in this massive mosaic, right? So it was that maybe the most difficult thing, is just learning how all of these different flows work.
It would have been easier to write the book about the Venezuelan grid than it would have been to try to attempt to give a cursory overview of the grid that we have in the US. Because at least in Venezuela, there's a single moderating agent, right? Or the Chinese grid. You just talk to the Chinese Communist Party and they basically tell you what the rules are. When you get into the US and you start trying to explore the grid, and you explore it, because it's kind of two things conceptually, right? It is a physical thing that we take for granted. We physically take for granted the fact that every device in my household that is not getting juice from my solar panels on my roof has to be connected to a wire. And on the other end of that wire is a generator. It is another solar panel or a wind farm or some thermal generation. And that thing, it has to be kept in a certain hertz band 24/7, 365. So there's the technological problem. There's the physical thing that we take for granted because we're at the final mile of it. And it's kind of funny because I saw, it must have been a tweet that I saw that somebody said that it's not, when it comes to grids, you don't have a final mile problem. You have a like 7.5 million mile problem to get you from high voltage to the household. Because it's easy to get electricity from like Colorado to Las Vegas. It goes on high voltage transmission lines and it rips over there. That's not the hard thing. The hard thing is that the tens of thousands of houses in my town all require a single cable or multiple cables that have to connect it to that thing. And so the problem is the extra 7-something million miles of wire that you have to lay, not the final mile. It's not the final mile. The US grid is not just a physical thing, it's also a political thing. And it is so aggressively political. And within that, you have committee on committee, and you have governing body, and you have quasi-governmental entities, and you have strictly governmental entities, and you have private businesses. And all of these are hyper-jurisdictional. And outside of Texas, where is the only place where you would kind of immediately get, 3 different service providers, 4 different service providers trying to sell you electricity, most people only connect to one person to buy their electricity from. They're not shopping around to figure out rates in the same way that you might if you would just move to Austin or Dallas or something like this.
Hash price hit a rock bottom at record lows of 0.00069 BTC per petahash per day, or around $39 per petahash per day. On the other side, over at NiceHash, pay rates are skyrocketing, practically hitting pre-halving levels once again. Right now, NiceHash is averaging 0.00140 BTC per petahash per day. That's about $80 per petahash per day. The delta in pay rates between NiceHash and leading FPPS pools is 110% in favor of NiceHash. Connecting to NiceHash is just as easy as joining any other mining pool. Head over to nicehash.com and be ahead of your competition.
This is a really important point that is it's tangentially related to the book, but obviously it's in the book. This kind of knowledge is foundational to what you're writing about. But this really blew my mind when I was talking to someone from Texas, a former colleague at Luxor, Colin Kelly. I don't think I appreciated this because I was asking him about his power rates, and he was talking about that he has choices. And I was like, what do you mean? You can just go and talk to different power providers? Because the only systems that I've ever worked under are NES, Nashville Electricity Services in Nashville. That's city run. The entire power grid in Nashville is run by the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. One of the only good things that FDR ever did. That's a provocative statement, but you purchase it from NES, which gets it from TVA. When I was in Denver, it was what, Pacific Power? Well, I don't even know who the power provider is in Denver. I didn't obviously pay attention to my bills very much, but here in Oregon, it's Pacific Power, a company owned by Berkshire Hathaway. And the rate that you get is the rate that you get, buddy. You have no options. And I just feel like this cannot be highlighted enough in terms of when people talk about how Texas has the most free market grid of any state, or people often say unregulated or deregulated, which is not true. It's obviously regulated, but it's not as contained as other places. It's where you literally have the option to go to different providers.
That's right.
And I don't really have anything else to say about that. I just think it's an important point to highlight. It's also why a bunch of Bitcoin miners have been going there. But
it's bizarre to think about, right? You think as a consumer of a commodity, right? You probably don't shop around for who gives you your natural gas if you have natural gas in your home. You don't shop around for your electricity. You're just a ratepayer. You're not really a customer. You don't really mean anything to the person selling you the power, because they know that whoever is going to be in that household, you might use more or less power, but they know that you're their customer, which is an interesting kind of cartelization of commodity consumption that we don't really think about at all. I've never had that thought like you were saying until I had a buddy move into Texas and start saying like, oh yeah, they were gonna give us a free like flat screen TV and like a month off, and I was like, dude, they're trying to sell. That's how important selling you the power is, and they're still gonna charge you like 4 cents a kilowatt hour, and you have on peak and off peak. Like, we don't think about that in the rest of the U.S. Like,
no.
You never think about, I will pay less for electricity if I turn it off at a certain point, or if I don't run the dishwasher now, I run it later. That's been totally extrapolated from us. The only kind of analogous system that I think exists is like the medical and insurance system, where like you're never really quoting prices for what you pay in insurance. It's like this negotiation between the doctor and the insurance company, and you're just kind of there like carrying a policy, waiting to figure out what your copay is and then how much they want to try to charge you over that. It's a very bizarre system that is not necessarily kind of the most free market or open and unrestricted as one might think. So I definitely have felt that pain.
Yeah, I bet. And I think the closest analogy I can think with energy and with other commodities is probably just gasoline. Yeah. Because there are, depending on where you are, I'm thinking of Nashville as a reference point here. You go to North or East Nashville or out towards the airport in the Donaldson area, gas is cheap. You go to the suburbs, you go to some of the wealthier counties like Williamson, it's more expensive. So you can kind of arbitrage a little bit. But prices in hyper-located areas tend to converge on a single rate. Yeah. There may be a little bit of a delta, but it's like 5 cents, maybe 10 cents if you're lucky, 20. You don't get that much of a difference. And I really like that point that you made about other commodities don't really work this way, like Texas's grid. So this kind of leads into my next question, just sticking on the grid point for a second. You talked about how it's political. In your research, did you find certain areas being more amenable to energy sectors and as a result, proliferating cheaper energy for people? I mean, Texas is the obvious example here. Yeah. They've obviously had some problems recently with some power price spikes. There have been shortfalls on the grid from intermittent energy sources like wind and solar when it's too hot and people are ramping up their ACs, or during Winter Storm Uri, I think it was a few years ago. Yeah. When, you just had wind farms stop working. But were there any jurisdictions where you felt like this is really good for energy production, that the savings are passed on to the consumer, and other places where you're like, this is terrible, they are hamstringing everyone? What kind of a spectrum were you looking at during your research?
It's a good question. And it's such a rat's nest that if you've heard of the writer Meredith Angwin, who wrote a book called Shorting the Grid, she goes in a multi-100-page book into great detail about how these grids work and how the various load resources interact with the federal, state, or local entities and how they get the interconnects. And she really gets into the brass tacks of it. I made a very conscientious decision to preserve my sanity and to only give the higher level kind of cursory view of the system. Because as I said, it's so hyper local. It's so hyper local. And the Bitcoin miner has to deploy in a single space, in a single physical location. Yes, we can be mobile. Yes, you can jump from one well to another or another substation, but that's not what I'm referring to. But you have to be in a physical space to deploy your hash. And that particular, say if you're connecting to a transformer on a small substation, 20 megawatt substation that has, only 3 megawatts of consumption because the factory at the end of the line actually never stood up or went out of business, right? You are solving as a Bitcoin miner a hyper local infrastructure problem for whoever is managing that element of the grid. So realizing that bridging that gap would be insanely difficult, because if you go to the Pacific Northwest and they have a lot of hydro there, old military implementations, things like this, like big sites, to talk about what it would mean or what the contracting would look like for an entity like that would be so profoundly different from looking into CAISO in California, would be so profoundly different from looking into ERCOT, would be so profoundly different looking into Southwest Power Pool, because they would all be living in a place that had a different mix of generation, had totally different kind of discrete governing structures. There would be a lot of similarities in the way that they operated, right? They in principle would be doing fundamentally the same things in terms of the service that they were providing to customers. But I chose to keep it high level because it's such a huge gap to bridge between the physical deployment of the Bitcoin miner and the particular place where you'd want to be deploying. A good example mentioned in the book is in Southwest Power Pool. There's this corner of Oklahoma where about 25% of the year the price of electricity is negative, and the reason for that is because you have a ton of solar and a huge amount of wind, and they all built these huge facilities using a mix of state or federal credits or tax abatements or things like this. So you have these huge production that is non-dispatchable. You can't call it and ask for more. So if I build a 100 megawatt wind farm and the wind is blowing, when the wind is blowing, I want to be selling my 100 megawatts. The catch is the dude a mile away from me, he's getting the wind as well. He also wants to be selling his megawatts. So you wind up bidding down the price of electricity to sub-zero, and still having companies that either need to stay up by mandate or have some base generation they have, or they're fighting for the interconnect to actually be using what they are producing on the grid. That's so insanely complicated. And the deployment of what a Bitcoin miner would look like on that particular implementation would be insane. That being said, it's a pretty juicy looking pear to take a bite out of, right? Anytime somebody, you can look at the public data and see that the price of electricity is negative 25% of the year, makes me think like, you need to go become buddies with some large wind farms or do some behind the meter, do a big behind the meter deployment, but then you
gobble up a few S19s and M30s for $200 or something, and just throw those suckers on a wind farm.
And that gets you into a whole other rabbit hole.
Right, for sure. And that's a really good example of a hyper-specific energy setup that is just ripe for Bitcoin mining. Because another thing about a lot of the wind and solar farms, if they don't have a hookup, if they're not interconnected, and a lot of them, obviously end up getting that way. But I've driven from Nashville to Denver many times, and West Kansas and East Colorado is nothing but wind. And the population density out there is very, very scant.
Yep.
And so for places like that, you don't often have enough consumers locally to soak up all of that electricity, right?
That's right.
I think that, there are a lot of companies working on this. Soluna is one of them, but a lot of great companies that are, I think SAS Mining is another that you talk about actually in your, in the interview section of the book. And all of these guys are finding a niche with renewable energy. And I find it pretty fascinating. It's also a really kind of nice, easy ace to bring out whenever anyone talks about how wasteful Bitcoin mining is and how it's bad. And like whether, it's not going to, like you said earlier, like with off-grid gas mining, it's not going to save the world. It's not even necessarily as big as a lot of people say it is in terms of the actual scale. You still have the riots of the world. You still have a lot of mega farms that are hooked up to the grid. But anytime anyone brings that up, I'm like, actually, did you know that Bitcoin mining can incentivize renewable production and monetize stranded energy sources? And it's always worth bringing up, I think, especially in the mainstream, because everything's still so misunderstood. But as you said, it's much more complicated, obviously, than I'm saying. It's like, let's just get some M30s and throw those suckers on a wind farm. It's like, it doesn't really work like that, dude. I could imagine that trying to dissect those energy systems would just be a headache. And kind of a good segue into the next question I have, and we kind of talked about it before the call, but there's a lot that you could have put into this book. I mean, I think I said that there's an inexhaustible amount of words or number of words that you could throw into something like this. You could have 1,000-page volumes on all of these different considerations with mining. You mentioned that you want to do a refresh of the book. You mentioned that there's more stuff to put in. What are you looking towards, and what are you looking forward to putting in the next iteration and next version of this? What kind of blind spots did you have when you were first writing about it? What kind of things did you not put in, maybe leave out on purpose because you didn't have enough time to research? It wasn't within the first scope. What things do you think need to go into another version or the next version of this book?
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, there's small stuff and there's always stuff that will drive you nuts. So the best example is maybe less than a week after we went to print and it was final drafts, everything signed off on, super happy, let's do it. Mara comes out and announces that they are now producing 2-phase cooling. Doesn't exist in the book. So just as a kind of the high level overview, right? That the only 2 or 3 methods of cooling that I really discuss is the idea of air cooling, immersion cooling, and hydro cooling. So air cooling, that's your cyber hornets, what everybody knows and loves. Immersion cooling is basically take a machine, you can either modify it or buy immersion specific machines and then dunk it in a tank. There's loads of manufacturers that are putting together these systems, anywhere from single machine systems up to, 20, 30 machines in a tank. These immersion setups with the dielectric oil that everybody knows about. And then the hydro machines that everybody sees at these kind of thin kind of blade servers that go into a standard server rack setup and use water. And I talk about that from the perspective of the ability to cool. So your heat transfer coefficient and how you have a gain by using certain types of coolants. So air transmits heat, not as well as oil. Oil is substantially better than that. And then you even get a bump from oil to hydro. But that's kind of moderated by the fact that the technology is a bit more complicated. You need the machines. You have this kind of chicken or egg situation of, okay, well, I can take 10,000 air-cooled machines and modify them into being immersion machines. I can't do that for air-cooled machines into hydro machines. I would have to pull heat sinks and put in water blocks. Just infrastructure-wise, it's really hard. And it's not that it won't get solved. It's just very early for us in terms of being an industry. Well, Mara comes out with this very cool technology that is 2-phase cooling. And they don't mean 2-phase in terms of like phases of electricity. You have single-phase machines or 3-phase machines. What they mean is 2 phases, like 2 elemental phases. So they basically took a device that is normally used it's called a vapor degreaser that is used to clean industrial parts. And so if you Google a vapor degreaser, you will see a device that looks exactly like their 2-phase mining setup, because it is a vapor degreaser. And what a vapor degreaser is used for, if you're not mining Bitcoin, which it's the first time they've used it for this application, is that you have a heating element in the bottom of a closed tank. Oh, perfect picture. You have a heating element in the bottom of a closed tank. You have solvent that's sitting in the tank. Say I'm manufacturing gears, right? And they're really complicated, 3-dimensional, screw-looking gears, right? That is really hard to clean. It's really hard to clean with just like a normal liquid solution. So what I do is I put it in the solvent. I heat the solvent. The solvent gets into every nook and cranny of that high geometry part. It boils off. It turns from liquid to gas. That's the 2-phase part. That gas now condenses on a freeboard chiller. It's essentially kind of the same thing that your AC has, these condenser coils. It condenses on those condensing coils, drips down, turns back into a liquid. That's when the heat is removed from it. Then you clean that up and you have a nice little closed loop system. And you're able to kind of cycle this solvent through and clean your part. They did something super, super smart, which is they took an existing industrial technology and they use the miner as the heating element. And so now I pack my tank full of miners, I fill it with solvent, my miners boil off the solvent, and it goes from a liquid to a gas. I run that through a condenser coil that can go through a dry cooling system or low grade heat. I can preheat the water for a town, right? Now I cycle that solvent back through and I'm using industrial equipment that was used for another purpose. I've replaced an element, the heating element, and my ASICs basically get to be super high density and super performant, and they clean themselves while they run, which is unbelievable. But that's nowhere in the book, right? That's something that is just, it's a new technology. It's developed. It's super cool. It would be a mega pain in the butt to scale from like a business perspective in terms of like trying to service every boiler room in New York, I think. And the fact is like the solvents can be very expensive, and like as long as the pressure doesn't get too high, you want to be careful you don't like put a bomb in the basement of your building, because you still are consuming, like half a megawatt, 3/4 of a megawatt, right, that's boiling off this liquid that costs on the order. Last time I checked, it was like $10,000 per 55-gallon drum. So it's expensive stuff. So that's something that's missing just from like the technological standpoint, right? Cool invention that came out, something that should be included. Another thing is the bit axe. The bit axe guys weren't super out about their stuff. And now that it's out, and so I'm itching. I've already talked to Scott. I'm like, listen, man, I need you to contribute some stuff because I want to celebrate this cool work you're doing on the open source side. From a high level, the one thing that's missing in the book that I'm excited to put into the second part is the first part of the book is very kind of didactic. It's trying to walk you through the pieces, let you understand the chessboard, let you understand what each of the chess pieces does, how it's allowed to move. And then I go, okay, well, I'm not going to detail every business model for you. That seems a little ridiculous. And I would lose the audience because nobody wants to look at spreadsheets. What if we then talk to the people who are practitioners, and I can editorially find people who are mining in very different ways. Econo Alchemist, who is very concerned with privacy, very concerned with no KYC sats. Kent from SAS Mining, who's trying to offer a consumer product through SAS Mining that allows folks to acquire Bitcoin more directly. You talk to Jason Less and Bob Burnett, who have very different ideas about mega mining versus sort of horse scale mining, is what Bob calls his theory of the mine of the business. What if I kind of let the business people speak, and you could surface up how they think about these levers? And I think that those are two great pieces, but I think I'm missing a piece in the middle. I think what I'm missing is the microeconomics of the Bitcoin mine, right? What's the theory of the mine? Can I give people a little bit more to chew on so that they can kind of think about the business through, the transformer, the cooling system, maybe even the financial side of things, in terms of the financial resources people have to even run these businesses, before I let you talk to the people. So I'm not sure what that will look like. It's still kind of very early days where it's like, oh, dang, I want to give you a little bit more to chew on before I kind of let you out to talk to the practitioners. I think there's something there that I'll be gnawing on for the next 3 to 9 months before I can send an update in for print.
In the competitive world of Bitcoin mining, one name stands out: CleanSpark, America's Bitcoin miner. At CleanSpark, efficiency isn't just a goal, it's our standard. Our sophisticated facilities are built and led by expert teams who care about Bitcoin and the communities we work in. Scale? We've mastered it. Our large-scale operations have set us apart in the industry as examples of community-oriented building. Our track record speaks for itself. We navigate the complexities of the new economy with precision and with skill, continuously achieving operational milestones. Curious about how we do it? We invite you to discover the story behind CleanSpark's success at cleanspark.com.
The microeconomics of the mine is something that is just continually evolving, right? Going back to what I said earlier, I think a lot of people still have this conceptualization of mining that is still kind of very immature in a way. And it's that you just plug in the miner and you let it rip. Well, we're really getting to a point where unless you find your edge, if you don't have cheap enough electricity, you can't do that. Unless you're finding a way to recycle the heat, unless you're finding a way to curtail during peak hours, unless you're someone like, Riot, who can curtail and then get power credits to lower their power costs. There are all of these considerations for operations where it's really not just plug that baby in and let it rip.
That's right.
And I think that going back to what you were saying about all the different operational perspectives, the microeconomics for each individual miner are much different, right?
Very different.
The home miner who wants to just stack sats is operating at a very high power price, right? Compared to the rest of the network. And they're either going to be okay with that and they're going to mine ideologically and just eat it, or they're going to find ways that they can reuse that heat to heat their homes. I know that you have done some work on this, seen some really impressive pictures from your Twitter on that. And then there's also considerations for mega miners where how much do they participate in demand response?
Yeah.
How much do they think about, well, maybe we can just slap a new center on this wind and solar farm, and then we're only up for, maybe 50, 70% of the time, but our power cost is super low. The last thing I wanted to hit on there, which I think we're really starting to see change, is the form factor of mining. You start the first Almanac on the idea of the shoebox miner. After the forget about Bitcoin, you say, I want you to envision an aluminum shoebox or something like that, right? And I've personally struggled to believe that in 10 years, that's going to be the standard for the big boys and for the professionals, right? And as you just said, with Mara's two-phase cooling, we're already starting to see this change with Bitmain's newest miner, the U3 S21 EXPH,
the worst naming standard ever.
Terrible. It just get someone in your marketing department to do better branding, please. It doesn't matter if you're the king, you can just do whatever. But it's a server rack style hydro cooled system, right? And however you feel about hydro, that I don't really care what you feel, not you necessarily. I care about everything that you feel about Rod, but our listeners, whether or not you care about hydro, the server rack is something that miners have been asking for a long time.
Yes.
Maybe we move to that with air cooling. I think eventually immersion, you'll see something similar in terms of a larger kind of rack model for that. You can't rack immersion, at least. Maybe you can, but most of the immersions I've seen, you don't do that because there's
a whole series of other issues you run into.
Something pretty dangerous. You have a lot of problems potentially. But anyway, the form factor is almost certainly going to change over the next decade. And just wanted to get some of your thoughts on where you think that's going. And I guess you kind of already did, but you seem to agree with that analysis that there's 100%. No way the shoebox is going to be the standard a decade from now.
Well, I mean, the correct answer is it depends, right? What are the kinds of form factors that we see now, right? We see the M something style, the M60s, I'm getting a little thumbs up. Look at that. We're seeing the M styles, which is kind of reminiscent to the S9. That makes sense. Same engineer kind of designed that. You have the S19, S21 style, which is kind of the stacked, larger, chunkier looking box. You have the hydro miners that kind of resemble the S19 whatevers with these weird, funny tubes coming out the back of them. You have the blade style servers, which I am inclined to believe, as you are, that there is some. We talk about standard server and data center functions as being kind of very unique from Bitcoin mining deployments. But what I think people need to remember is that most of these early days Bitcoin mining farms were set up with the kind of atom-backed chicken shack miner mindset. Mm-hmm. It's this kind of trend towards being as parsimonious as possible because every additional dollar makes the bear market substantially more painful. Every dollar that you spend in setting up your facilities. So there has been this sentiment that you have to do things really fast. Which everyone's trying to do it fast. And you have to try to manage your costs. Now, of course, in the case of a mega miner, they're trying to do it fast, but they're swinging a much bigger bat with a lot more capital. what you see in the current kind of state of the art is nowhere near what would be considered like a refined standard in the decades of development that have happened in data centers. And so we think about them as two very distinct things, but I'm curious to see how these industries trend towards each other, because as the cooling footprint of the machine changes, right? As hydro machines become more ubiquitous, the natural place to plug them in is a standard server rack. We have decades of engineering behind standard server racks. We don't have that for PDUs. Most PDUs, which are, the big power strips that would be going to your machine sitting in a tank on a wall, most of those are not even like UL compliant or necessarily compliant with master electrician best practices. Like, I was having conversations with people about how they would be classified as what's an electrical gutter. And so the way in which you spec an electrical gutter, so think a PDU that has 24 different ports to plug in machines and one kind of termination that takes you back to your switchgear or whatever. That's a gutter technically under the specified handbook. When you look at that, almost nothing that's on the market actually falls in line with what would be considered appropriate or certifiable by a master electrician, because people have just been building things because they have to get them out, and they've been refining them because all these companies are startups. And this is what everybody forgets about the space is like, yeah, they may have signed a $50 million deal to produce all of these PDUs or a $50 million deal to produce these tanks, but this company didn't exist 5 years ago. It's the old news, we'll do it live. Everyone is doing it live. And I think people have really high expectations for how performant we should be or how advanced we are. But what I think they're missing is the fact that we're doing it live. We're all startups. And yeah, there's big money, there's big checks being cut, but we haven't yet even hit the optimal state of performance. I mean, I've seen issues in mines where smart PDUs in a large facility were all tripping on the same phase. And the PDU was a 3-phase PDU. And so if you know anything about electricity, you shouldn't have a phase imbalance on a 3-phase system. So most machines are kind of single phase, like the S19 series or the M30, M60 series, which means that if I go from my transformer, which is taking 3-phase, to some kind of big switchgear, that switchgear is the same thing as the breaker box attached to the side of my house. It's just a way bigger version of that. It's taking 3-phase and it's turning it into single phases, which means that I now have to kind of balance the legs. I have an A, a B, and a C phase because the machine that's all the way on the wall or in the tank is consuming electricity only on the A phase or only on the B phase or only on the C phase, which means if I lose a bunch of machines on a single part, I lose a bunch of my C phase, I wind up with an imbalance in my electrical system. It can be really hard for my infrastructure. Well, the newer model machines, so a lot of the new immersion Watts miners or the newer S21s are 3-phase direct, which means that when the power comes in from the transformer, 3-phase, goes to the switchgear, still 3-phase, goes to the machine, consume 3-phase, which is great because everything should remain kind of in balance. I've been seeing mines where, because it's the first time that these things have been deployed in large scale, they're getting phase imbalances and people are going, what are you talking about? There's no the rules of electricity say this shouldn't be possible. And it's something as simple as the way that I design my PDU doesn't have enough airflow. And because it's a smart PDU, it turns out it's actually drawing like a couple hundred watts. And that couple hundred watts is actually enough to throw off my 3-phase, because when I'm doing it in a 50 or 100 megawatt building, it's all additive. And when I'm doing it and it gets really spicy and I have to be cooling everything down all the time, it's an additive system. And so I wind up with all these engineering or these tech problems. So a bit of an aside, but so much to say that we're all doing it live. What you are looking at right now in any mega facility, or no matter how clean the air, the immersion, or the hydro setup is, just recognize that it's like we are barely out of beta. We're barely out of beta. And we are going to start, at least in my guess would be, we're going to start picking up best practices from the data center world as we start having the tools like these blade style hydro machines. We're going to start realizing like, hey, these guys actually know what they're doing. And we're kind of like, the bootleg weird cousins in the boonies that want to like rip dirt bikes in the backyard and like throw the Bitcoin miners into the rack. and you guys are like running AWS, triple backup, like super high tiered, incredible 99 point whatever upside. And we're just sitting here like, you got to turn it off. Whatever, turn it off, dude. We'll turn it back on at 7 when the price goes down. Like, that's kind of us. But I think there's going to be a meeting of the minds.
Yeah, it's like Beverly Hillbillies or something. It's a very salient.
Beverly Hillbillies.
Yeah, I love this image of Bitcoin miners ripping dirt bikes by like an oil well or something with, like a shoe rack with a couple of S19s on them or something, and like corrugated tin lean-to. Yeah, I mean, it's a super salient point about the fact that we're still in the infancy of all of this, and which seems strange considering we do have the Riots of the world and the Core Size of the world and the Maras of the world running multiple 100-megawatt facilities that are huge. And like you've been in these facilities, I've been in these facilities. There's really something impressive about them. It's also something that kind of makes my skin crawl a little bit. I have to kind of keep myself intellectually honest, where I'm like, it's like this. I don't know. Maybe the critics have something to say. Like, it seems kind of weird. But I don't really think that. Please don't come at me with your pitchforks. I don't think we should shut down these facilities. They pay for the power. It's their right to use it. But we're still very much in the infancy, and people have no idea. I don't, because I have not researched it, what the data center industry went through in the early ages of the internet, right? We had no idea. And they had the benefit of the military and the US government probably holding their hands, because the internet was an invention and came out of our military. And, they had kind of the power apparatus behind them, and we haven't. We've been, like you said, the redneck cousins ripping dirt bikes in the backwoods.
Free market,
baby. Always been a pariah. We've always been on the outside. And to your point, we are starting to see a meeting of minds. I wonder how much we can learn from them, or the miners can learn from the data center guys. And there's a part of me that also wonders how much we're going to be able to learn. Because I do think that, I just saw the news today about Constellation Energy reopening 3 Mile Island.
Yeah, I saw that.
Crazy, just a crazy contract with Microsoft. Microsoft is asking for as much as they can get of 3 Mile Island's 880 megawatt capacity for a 20-year contract. And rumors stipulate that they're paying $100 per megawatt hour. That's crazy when you think about the fact that New York State's average industrial rate kind of ranges between $60 to $70 per megawatt hour. It's pretty good.
Yeah.
But, I was talking to one of my buddies who works in the industry, and he said that 100 megawatt rate is probably higher. That $100 per megawatt hour rate, that's probably the lower end of what's being talked about.
Yeah.
And I think that there's going to be obviously I'm not the first person to say this, there's going to be crazy competition between the miners and the hyperscalers and these data centers as these AI applications take off. That's kind of an aside. But the last thing I want to ask you before we wrap up here, you finish the book with a round of interviews of a bunch of different Bitcoin miners. Some are executives at big companies like Jason Less at Riot. Others are more guerrilla miners. Which, if any of these interviews grabbed you and kind of inspired you the most? I know that's kind of like a starry-eyed question, but what I really like about that section is it highlights how diverse this industry is. Yeah. That there is I think, what is the section? A mine for every miner, or what?
A model for every miner. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So which of these stories, if any, were really, you were like, damn, that's cool?
There's two. One is Charlie Spears of great acclaim and kind of the ordinals, fractal Bitcoin, like all things cutting edge and artsy and triggering to people. People don't know that his background is oil and gas. And he to me opened up something really interesting, which was, he said, a lot of these people have been sitting on 12 mines, or 12, not mines, 12 wells, 12, 20, 50 wells as these kind of legacy family wells. He's like, we're making the same thing that Exxon is doing. We're making gas. Like, we're doing the exact same thing. We're producing the exact same commodity. And sometimes they're our next door neighbors. And we're all profitable. Like, we're all making money. And that to me was this kind of click of, you actually don't get the asymmetry that people think that you get by being big as a Bitcoin miner. Your economy of scale doesn't come from your ability to generate revenue because that is linear. It comes from the kind of asymmetry that you're able to tap into, whether it's a power credit or selling power back or things at the grid level. And then it benefits you in some sense on the labor side, but that's a whole other rat's nest because you're picking up newer problems when you try to set up a 100 megawatt building versus a 2 megawatt or 1 megawatt container. But inherently, you don't have access to more efficient machines just because you're bigger. You might get them a little cheaper, but that scales linearly. Like if you can break down 1 megawatt with the most efficient machines, it's going to be as efficient as 100 megawatts with the most efficient machines. Barring whatever sort of small ancillary system you might need to run or the bits and pieces that would go into that, right? So the asymmetry is not necessarily what you think it is. You're just contributing more linearly to the network, which means that your gross revenues are higher, but you're not getting it necessarily more efficiently. That was kind of a light bulb moment that we're kind of similar to the oil and gas industry in that way. The second one was talking to Eric Hersman of Gridless Compute. And it's so funny because he is the perfect person to talk to about, based out of Kenya, multi-entrepreneur. He is going out and he's connecting Bitcoin miners with either proposed or existing energy solutions in rural Africa. And everybody just absolutely starts goobing out and turning into idiots. Oh, we're going to save the African continent. We're gonna bring the mining. It's beautiful. I can already see the National Geographic documentary that they're going to do about this. And he just looks at it and he goes, listen, here's the deal. Everyone who does these projects has to go bullshit people to go raise $10 million to go put a turbine or put some hydro implementation on some rural place in Africa. And they all do the same bullshit when they fudge the numbers and they just make it up. And they go, hey, Mr. NGO, can I have $3 million to go build this 0.5 megawatt generator? And look at my model. If you look at my model, you will see in year 1, we will have 15% use of this generating site. But in year 2, we will have 25% because we are growing the town. We have built it. The people will come. And Eric's like, listen, that doesn't happen. It's fake. It's nonsense. It's a good marketing department. It's a good pitch. We're going to save the universe. In year 7, in year 20, the town is going to be bustling. All the kids are going to be cruising around on hoverboards. The sun will rise over the Serengeti and the Lion King theme will, it's just fluffy and it's ridiculous and it's nonsense because all of your money is coming from NGOs and people that you have to just make a puff piece for and say, oh, boo-hoo to Africa, boo-hoo to these rural kids. And to him, and to me too, what a ridiculously offensive way to do development. Development should be asset-based. We have great people. We have an incredible community, and we have a lot to offer. And we're going to do it in a way that is value additive. But the whole theme of this nonprofit NGO community is very much like, no, the people are suffering and they are tired and they are huddled masses, and we have to go rescue them. And what I love about what he's doing is that he just guts the whole system. He says, listen, here's what we're going to do. Day 1, when you set up that hydro facility, I'll take 80% of your power. You know what? Yeah, day 1, I'll take 80% of your power. And I'm making up a number. Because I know the town can only use 15%. Okay. Oh, and guess what? I need to train like 4 dudes from the town to help me run this site. Okay, cool. And you need me to turn off? Yeah, I need you to turn off. Okay. In the afternoons. Okay, so now I've dropped a business that's profit driven, so it's value additive. I've just built a bunch of jobs in a rural community. It's value additive. It is not this sort of this like poverty porn that I think everybody is sick of like, oh, we're going to go save the world. It's using a purely free market business solution to add value to a community where that's people's homes. It's where they want to be. It's where they want to contribute. And without it, you have a higher cost of electricity, and you have somebody else that's sitting, 1,000 miles away in in a large NGO with the Rockefeller Foundation in a skyscraper in New York somewhere going, should we do the $3 million to Kenya or should we do Lesotho this year? I just don't know. You get to be a master of your own fate. And so that's what I love about what he's doing is that he gutted this whole sort of like external handout to please give me money kind of ethos and said, nope, we're going to handle it internally. And what's more is that he's going to set up the GAMA, the Green African Mining Alliance. He's going to teach everybody else to do it. And to me, I think that is probably the coolest thing ever, that he's using this kind of very new technology with a pure free market solution to add value to a community and never have to sell it down the river and say, oh, well, these guys, they need the money because they're struggling, they're terrible. No, like it's investing in the assets that are these communities, not having to reframe them as these tired, huddled masses that need saving from some large dollar donor in some other country.
Right. And I love Eric's model. I think that Gridless is a super cool company. I'm happy that you interviewed them for the book. I was excited to see that during my read through. And I think that you bring up a really good point, and he brings up rather a really good point about the NGOs. Without an actual consumer of that electricity, there's no reason to build these things. And that's why Bitcoin mining, I think, can be such a catalyst for change there, because now not only are you making the micro hydro dam profitable, you're also hiring those guys from the region. Now they have additional income that they can put back into the community. And this is something that Peter McCormick pointed out. I can't remember if it was on a podcast that I was listening to or if it was when I recorded with him in Nashville a while back. Mm-hmm. But he said, once you have that, the kind of downstream effects of that are, the hydro grid is profitable. You have money to invest in the community. Now the store owner can buy a refrigerator. Now they can sell a Coke through that refrigerator that someone else actually has the income to buy because they're working at the mine.
That's right.
And there's actual legitimate benefits. It's slowly accretive. And it sounds counterintuitive when you talk about it. It's like, okay, we're going to slap a Bitcoin mine here and it's going to use the majority of the energy. And then people say, well, wait, the energy is for the community. And it's like, well, the community isn't energized.
That's right.
They don't have the infrastructure set up for this.
And guess who's funding your generator to go pull all the wires to everybody's houses? The person who's currently paying the bill, the guy who's using 80% of the electricity.
Right.
He's paying that rate, which means that all of a sudden your company, your generator is more profitable, so that when somebody does want to get connected to that grid, that's substantially cheaper.
Yes. And I think that this is something you kind of talked about, the cold numbers of the capitalist mindset with this. But it's the only thing that will really make that work, is something that's profit driven, that works for everyone, right? Because it isn't a philanthropy thing. It is a practical business model that actually does have positive effects. I think we live in this weird time in our postmodern world where for certain people, anything that's like profit driven is somehow icky. Mm-hmm. But that's how you create actual value in the real world that can enrich people's lives, right? And it's not just, we're going to throw you $10 million to set up a dam. Oh, but we didn't think about who's actually going to be purchasing this energy. We didn't think about how we're going to actually deploy this energy at scale.
That's right.
And that really is, we covered RFK's letter to The Economist this week on the Mining Pod News Roundup yesterday. Mm. And this talking point that we have about Bitcoin monetizing energy assets is entering the Overton window. And it really is the most exciting thing. And one of the coolest things about proof of work. It's almost in some ways an auxiliary benefit, because the whole point of proof of work is to have a distributed system where no one can double spend, be able to have a permissionless, censorship-free, decentralized system where you don't have to worry about the chain of custody for your funds. Mm-hmm. But what's incredible is that at this point and at this scale, maybe Satoshi foresaw this. I have a hard time thinking that he did. It's actually a piece of the modern grid and modern energy infrastructure, in as much as if you have a dispatchable load that can turn on and off at a dime, that is unprecedented, honestly, in the scope of modern humanity. I can't think of any other energy consuming either business, individual, or device that is agnostic in that way that you can just deploy whenever you need it.
Which
and
is
that
insane.
was one of it is insane.
It's purely price sensitive. It's not production sensitive. Like if you had a large load like a steel mill, and that's who the old school equivalent to the Bitcoin mine on the grid would be, like a large steel mill that had a whole bunch of runs of steel, but they're running a process. They're running an industrial process. And so there's times where if I'm going to run this huge load of steel, I can't shut off. I can't. If I have to go from the first step of melting everything down and then pushing it into the next part of the factory and then extruding it out to turn it into railroad lengths of railroad run like steel or whatever that might be, I can't stop that process when it's going. But the nature of Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining is that if I want to stop the process, I stop it now. And there's nothing there's no work that's lost. I haven't lost any work because it's something that's doing trillions of calculations or hundreds of trillions of calculations a second. I just stop at what I was doing. And now that energy is available to be somewhere else. There's no additional process that needs to be accounted for.
Right. And you can't do this with data centers because then someone can't access something on the web.
Because then I can't Google goldfish or pull up CoComelon to play in the car,
Yeah, exactly. Well, Rob, I had a blast with this conversation, man. I really appreciate you hopping on. Where can people find you? Where can people buy your book? Take this time to shill your bags, sir.
Yes, I get to enter my grift phase of contributions. I love it. Find me at Bikes and Bitcoin on Twitter, Rob Warren. You can find the book on Amazon. You can find the book on the Bitcoin Magazine publisher's website. Either one is good. Just get in there, get yourself a copy. I can tell you there are physical copies that are out. There is the ebook version that is out, and there is now currently working on actually the audiobook version that's going to come out. So that will probably be in the next couple of months. You can listen to me while you're getting swole at the gym or you're dropping your kids off at school or anything like that. So DMs are always open. I love to schmooze with folks and talk about this stuff. I'm more than accessible and easy to find, and always happy to talk about this weird world that we're operating in.
I'm really happy that you're doing the audiobook yourself. I think that adds a nice touch.
It's hard though, I tell you what, to not
I don't even want to know, dude. I've thought about that a lot, about how painstaking it would be to record an audiobook, and I just hope that I'm never in that situation. Actually, no, I should say that. I do hope I'm in that situation one day, because it'll mean that I actually wrote something that I care to turn into an audiobook. But
there you go.
Anyway, Rob, thank you so much for joining us today, man. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, yeah.
For all of our listeners, we hope you have a good weekend, and please be sure to follow us at the Mining Pod, at Blockspace Pod on X, formerly Twitter. I'm kind of making that transition. It's been tough for me. Please follow me at As I Lay Hodling on X as well, and be sure to tune in to all of our content on YouTube or at blockspace.media. Subscribe to our newsletters. Keep an eye on our RSS feed. We're pumping out content like this all the time. Much love, everyone. Y'all have a good weekend.